Welcome to Impossible Trade-Offs. I am your host, Katie Harbath. Today we are joined by Renee DiResta. Renee is a researcher who has spent the last at least 10 years really researching the online information environment. She sort of fell into it or got into it when she was a new mom in the Bay Area around vaccines. And she has been the subject of a lot of controversy around her work. And she now has a new book out called Invisible Rulers, which I really encourage you all to read. I found it to be a very easy read. I found it to be super interesting. I learned things, even though I've been following this space quite a bit. I love how she ties stuff back to the 1920s. That's where the book title comes from. I find it interesting that, all these conversations that we've had with folks like Nina and Brian and now Renee really talk about how pivotal the time period around 2013 and 2014 was in really starting to see the emergence of how the online information environment was starting to be shaped. And so I wanted to bring Renee on to talk about her book, to talk about her research and what she has learned from all of this. And so I hope that you enjoy. Renee, welcome to Impossible Trade-Offs.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Let's start first with just you giving us a little bit about your background and sort of how you got into the work that you're doing right now.
Sure. So it's kind of a roundabout story. I had a bunch of different jobs over the years. I worked at Jane Street for a long time, for about 8 years. Then I went into venture capital. Then I started a couple companies when I was out in the Valley. I had my first kid in 2013, though, and I started researching the anti-vaccine movement online because I kept getting pushed this stuff, particularly as a new mom on Facebook. The content was coming to me constantly. You should join this group. You make your own baby food. Probably you don't vaccinate your kids. Here's this group. Go join it. And I found it actually, I found it really obnoxious, candidly. And so I just started paying attention to it, paying a lot of attention to how that movement was growing. And about a year later, there was a measles outbreak in Disneyland, and I got very involved in a law that did pass in California. I got involved in passing that law, and it was called SB 277, and it was this bill that said you couldn't have just a personal belief exemption. You couldn't just say I don't want to vaccinate and that's it, because that was what was happening. And so vaccination rates had really been steadily declining in California. And I had moved from New York, and I found this kind of outrageous, actually, that you didn't have to prove a religious belief. You didn't have to do anything except say, I don't want to vaccinate. And then that was the end of it. Uh, so getting involved in that campaign, just kind of as an activist mom, I started doing a lot of network mapping, trying to understand who was influential in the anti-vaccine movement. How did it work? Twitter was becoming, kind of a big deal around that point. Or actually, it was, I think, already a big deal by that point. The Arab Spring had happened. It was pretty clear that social media could have pretty profound impacts on politics. And so I started paying attention to how, both what was happening algorithmically as far as what was going viral, what was being pushed to me, but also in terms of how the community, the sort of influencers and crowds, kind of shaped narratives about that bill. And most importantly, how there was nothing at all in place to counter it. There was no counter speech, there was no counter narrative. So even though the bill was polling quite high, even though people wanted that bill to pass, according to all of the polling that the politicians were doing in California, the social media conversation was overwhelmingly negative. And there were a lot of these fake accounts that were in the conversation, a lot of these automated accounts. This kind of like the golden age of bots in 2015. And so I started chronicling how that worked, right? How people shaped public opinion through this kind of new system. And that was, for me, I just found it fascinating. I was like, man, the world has changed, and like I'm like in it, And I don't think people have realized like what's going to come in quite the way that I'm seeing it here in this little fight in California.
Well, and what strikes me about that is that when you also talk to people that have been focusing on Russian disinformation and Russian interference, it's also around that 2013, 2014 time period as well. And so it's to your point of like not necessarily knowing what's coming, but there were a lot of people who at that period of time were starting to realize that these things were happening. At Facebook, we weren't necessarily, at least in the areas where I was at, that was not yet on our radar screen or even sort of thinking about it yet.
Yeah, so I was in the Valley at that point. Like I said, I was in startup land, but I had a lot of friends who were in data science at Facebook, at Twitter, at the big companies, Google in particular. And I started having breakfasts with friends, and I with a sort of ulterior motive, or it's like, okay, but I just want to show you this thing that I'm seeing, and I just want to make you aware of like this thing that I'm getting, and I started actually writing for Wired because, as you know, Russia was that was a thing, right? The invasion of Crimea was happening, the sort of combination of the little green men in the real world and then the weird accounts that were sort of socializing that turned out to be the Internet Research Agency. But there was also ISIS at the time, you remember, right? And
Yeah.
that was like there was nothing remotely surreptitious about that. That was just like right out there, right? Like Facebook was, I think, pretty early to dealing with the ISIS problems, but you would go on Twitter and there would be an attack in the real world, and then there would all of a sudden be this cloud of fanboys, right, boosting it, and you were reading these stories of women, particularly in Belgium, some in England, being recruited to go be like jihadi brides, right? Because you had these influencers, the sort of wives of ISIS, were these figures. They would put out these pictures of their lives, and people found it compelling, and these kind of like charismatic people. And then you were actually seeing this, excuse me, this recruitment pipeline. So watching just the dynamics of what was possible and how what were essentially propaganda campaigns could be wholly transformed on this new medium, I thought was, kind of fascinating, also a little bit terrifying.
So the reason we wanted to have you on the podcast is you've got a new book called Invisible Rulers. I didn't realize until reading it that that phrase came from the 1920s, right? Kind of, and I'm fascinated by the cycles that we go through in history and all of that. And so, be curious to know why you wanted to write the book, but also why you settled on that title.
Yeah, so I had pitched the book originally. The original pitch was I want to update manufacturing consent for the modern era, right? Maybe an arrogant sounding thing to broach, but I said, look, the last kind of the last the book that people still point to when they talk about propaganda is still Chomsky, right? It is still manufacturing consent. And this is written in the 80s. And ironically, that title dates back to the 1920s. A lot of people don't know that, but manufacturing consent refers to a phrase by Lippmann, by Walter Lippmann, who was a contemporary of Edward Bernays, who made the comment about invisible rulers that I'll explain in a second. But Chomsky kind of looked back to this argument. There were this famous set of debates, the Lippmann-Dewey debates, in which these two men are arguing about, does democracy need propaganda? And this is pre-World War II. So this is at a time when the word propaganda was not quite, it wasn't a pejorative. It was still sort of the original information kind of propagated to spread the faith, right? Kind of the word itself comes from the Catholic Church. And so there's this idea, this debate that's happening at the time about whether there has to be some sort of whether it is in fact the duty of the government to help shape public opinion, because in the 1920s they're arguing people have so much information, how can they possibly know what is true or make a good decision? So you have Lippmann arguing for a much more sort of controlled type of information flows in a democracy, and Dewey taking a little bit more of a no, the people will be able to make their own decisions. It's very paternalistic, the sort of Lippmann approach, while at the same time conceding that this still depends on some sort of noble, the sort of noble occupation of journalism, right? That journalists are going to be the ones who help them make these decisions. And then, so this very idealistic view of journalism on one side, very idealistic view of government on another side. Maybe the truth is sort of in the middle. Bernays is an interesting character. He's Sigmund Freud's grandson, and he is very much involved in the propaganda effort in the United States to sell World War II to the American people. And following that, he writes this series of books. One of them is called Propaganda, and he makes this argument that those who manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. And he refers to this concept of the invisible ruler, right? There are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. And what he's talking about is not the politicians, it's not the people you actually see on your TV screens, it's the people behind the politicians, right? It's the opinion shapers. And he describes them again as sort of public relations experts. He doesn't see the two things as distinguishable. So everything is a marketing campaign to Bernays. He becomes actually the sort of father of modern public relations. Everything is a marketing campaign. And so selling people a pack of cigarettes is the same thing as selling them an ideology. It's just a question of how and whom. And I always found that to be I found that book to be impactful to me as a reader because it made me think of influencers, right? This idea of, again, the influentials, the sort of figures who are helping shape public opinion that people don't necessarily look at even as opinion shapers. Oh, they're just like you and me. The politicians over there, they're doing something, but these other people, well, they're just, it's like me, but maybe with a few more followers. And so that was where the sort of idea came from to again pull a concept from the 1920s kind of into the modern era and to kind of connect the dots there and say, look, this is a very old phenomenon. Here's how it happens kind of in the modern era, which was kind of how again how Chomsky had done that with his book on propaganda and what I kind of ambitiously was sort of hoping to do with mine.
So, as part of that, because I really liked in the book, you separate out the different types of influencers. And I'm wondering if we can kind of go into that because I think that it's important. And so I pulled out entertainers, explainers, idols, and gurus. And it seems like the gurus are the ones that we should be that maybe are the most influential. I don't know if one's more influential than the other, but given how much that I think influencers are being talked about vis-a-vis the election and how we're seeing candidates use them a lot more and all of that. Walk us through sort of how you came up with those categories and how you are seeing them shape the public opinion.
So I made this little menagerie was what I called it because it turns out that in academia there is very little attention. There's sort of a weird gap here, right? Influencers, most of the kind of academic takes on literature, most of the academic literature on influencers comes out of like marketing, right? You can find papers marketing B schools, maybe, but there's kind of a gap actually. There's some people who've done great work. Shannon McGregor comes to mind on influencers in politics in an academic context, but there was very little that differentiated between, somebody like Charlie D'Amelio, right, who often is a very kind of apolitical influencer, or at least she was. I haven't kind of looked at her since October 7th, really, but there were a lot of these figures who were relatively apolitical. They wanted to just share, this is the dance routine I'm doing. These are the shoes that I just got. This is my unboxing of my makeup haul from Sephora, right? And so you have that kind of wholly apolitical entertainment based person, but they attract massive followings, right? And they become very powerful for brands to serve as kind of essentially marketing tools, right? That this is here are these shoes that I got, and also I'm getting a kickback from sharing them with you, which I may or may not disclose, even though legally I technically am obligated to at this point, right? So you have this sort of novel phenomenon, and so I wanted to come up with some way of describing the difference between political influencers and what maybe people conceptualize an influencer as like Charlie or Mr. Beast or somebody like that. There was at that point it became I had a lot of conversations with people. Here's this taxonomy that I'm thinking of. How are you thinking? What am I missing? How do you think I should do it? Ultimately, I came down. Gurus was an interesting one. There's a podcast that I loved called Decoding the Gurus. And I find it endlessly interesting because they find these folks who oftentimes will start as an entertainer. Russell Brand, for example, is, originally an actor, right? Becomes sort of an entertainer and a podcaster. And then all of a sudden, kind of has this political awakening, really kind of goes down the rabbit hole on a lot of stuff. I don't know if anybody's seen Russell Brand's Rumble channel lately, but it's like how they tried to kill you, what they are concealing from you, and that sort of extremely conspiratorial type language. But what's interesting is a lot of the time they've established their following by helping people live their lives, right? People are there, they're looking for some kind of guidance. Wellness influencers are huge, right? I don't feel very good. Modern medicine, particularly for women, right? Modern medicine isn't serving me very well. Here's this person who looks healthy. She's glowing. She's telling you about these smoothies she's eating. And then also she has some opinions about the COVID vaccine, right? And so you kind of come for the smoothies and then you get the rest of it. And it's interesting to watch, like to read the kind of the comments in those communities to get a sense of um, how people are like, wow, thank you so much for revealing this to me. Thank you for telling me this. They really trust these figures, right? These people that they are kind of following for guidance and life advice. And they're not necessarily differentiating between this person has expertise in yoga, but maybe doesn't have expertise in oncology. And maybe hearing from the yoga guru that I shouldn't take chemotherapy should be actually a glaring red flag. But that's not how it plays out in a lot of these communities. And so I wanted to get at that dynamic of these figures as people who their audiences trust because they meet a need, they meet an emotional need, they serve, they provide their community with entertainment and camaraderie, but this interesting decoupling of expertise and influence, right? So they're not necessarily qualified to be making some of the points they're making, but they can just kind of put their hands up and say, "Oh, I was just asking questions. I was just saying some stuff."
What I like about what you do in the book is really painting a picture for folks of how influencers might go from here's the smoothies I'm drinking to all of a sudden opining about politics and other things that they really don't have any expertise on, and also how that helps them get reach and how those two things are intertwined. So can you go through that a bit of and kind of paint that picture for folks?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of critiques. So one thing I did not want to do was write a book about social media, to be clear. And I feel like I say that like, page like 5 or something. A lot of the time when people are complaining about something that is going viral, it is like the assumption is that that is like quote the algorithm, right? That there is some sort of algorithmic process that has made that happen. And so I spend a lot of time in the book trying to get at what is the algorithm, right? Where can you place the blame, on kind of a sort of an amorality built into a system that doesn't actually know what it's boosting, doesn't really necessarily care what it's boosting, while also recognizing that all of that is keyed off of actions that people take, right? And so that's an interesting, it's an interesting process. We say go viral, as if it is a passive thing. Oh, it just went viral, somehow that happened. When in reality, it's a very active process, right? It's people hitting the retweet button or the reshare button. And so what I wanted to try to explain was in this process of influence and information sharing, the what I call the crowd or the sort of the faction in the political sense actually plays a really big role. So the influencer amasses this following. The more that they post, they're writing content both for the crowd who they want to boost it and for the algorithm who they know they can get some lift from, particularly on a platform like TikTok. And so you have this phenomenon where the influencer is kind of like playing to these two different types of entities that will boost her, that will give her that reach that she needs. She's also really out there constantly assessing, is the content resonant, right? There's sort of immediate feedback on a social media platform in a way that there isn't necessarily on broadcast or in print. But you can see the likes coming in, you can look at the sort of rates of engagement and things like that. And then this question of reach, relevance, and resonance are the three things. So it's like, is the content going far? Is it speaking to the audience? And is the audience engaging with it? Is it having some kind of impact on them? And are they sharing it? And I wanted to kind of explain. Again, this is language that comes from marketing. I think that framing reach, resonance, relevance is from 2012 from a guy named Brian Solis at I think he was Altimeter at the time. So again, a lot of the stuff that we are talking about in the context of influence and political content now in 2024, you do see the sort of first kind of models of how people shape public opinion kind of coming out of the marketing literature in 2012.
So one of the I was also thinking about in reading the first part of the book is um all of that is sort of giving the people what they want,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
And it's like, what do the people want? And
Yep.
you hear that a lot from Meta right now and all the controversy around whether or not political content, and they're going to boost that or not. And they're like, the people don't want it, so we're not going to give it to them. And so I'm curious how you think about that, because from a trust and safety perspective, on one hand, it's real arrogant of anybody to be like, I'm going to tell the people what they want, right?
Right.
And you've got to do, but on the other hand, if you do give the people what they want, it is a lot of clickbaity stuff. And it's not necessarily the most, stimulating stuff on the internet.
No. It is, and this has always been, the question I always thought about was like, where do you put the paternalism, right? Where does that come into play? Because something is being ranked at all times. This is a thing where one of my immense frustrations with the conversation, particularly the people who all of a sudden like hate content moderation and think that, someone is putting their thumb on their scale and trying to keep their content down, which, is an opinion held by virtually the entirety of the political spectrum at various points. There is no neutral. So there's two questions here. One, when do you give the people what they want, per your point? And two, is there any kind of ethical obligation if what the people want is something that has some seriously negative downstream consequences? And I talk about this in the book in the context, kind of continuing the thread related to the vaccine stuff I was looking at. Because when you start to see, for a long time, like I said, the anti-vax stuff was pushed to me. I didn't want it, right? I really, in fact, didn't want it. It made me insane. I was so angry about it. Um, but I kept getting it, right? Even before, and then unfortunately, like you like hate click on something. I do this with, I research all sorts of things on the internet, and AI has been a big one for me lately. And I cannot tell you, I'm flooded with AI generated like porn at this point, because I click on it for work, and that's what I get more of. And so you sort of you have this situation where there's an algorithmic system that is pushing something to you, and I do think that there is at some point a platform does have an obligation to look at what that is. This again, going back to the ISIS example. Remember in 2015, you could follow one jihadi account on Twitter and you would get like, oh, here are three more for you. Here are three more. Here are three more. Here are three more you might like. And I thought this was like the most surreal thing I'd ever seen. Why are we doing this? And with the vaccine stuff, to go back to kind of, sorry, I didn't really close that out. You start to see Facebook begin to remove stuff from recommendations, right? They're trying to strike this balance. They say, okay, it can stay on the platform, but we're not going to recommend it. This is where you get to the do not recommend kind of conversations that are happening in 2018. And that's because you start to see measles outbreaks happening in Brooklyn and then in Samoa. And in the one that happens in Samoa, about 85 kids die. And what people are doing on Facebook while that is happening is the anti-vaccine activists on Facebook are telling their, within their groups, they're telling them to go deluge the pages of the government of Samoa, which has just instituted an emergency measles vaccine campaign, again, because babies are dying. These are kids under 5 that are dying in Samoa. And the American anti-vaccine activists are there barraging the government pages, telling people, no, 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 this is poison. This is what caused the outbreak, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is where you start to see Facebook trying to come up with this question of, can you allow something to be on a platform while not proactively serving it up? And that, I think, is the interesting question that ties into, do you give the people what they want? I think in some cases, the answer is clearly yes, right? And that's where when you look at Facebook's top content reports, even now, what you see is like, Lad Bible, you see weird AI generated kitchen pictures, you see you see videos of dogs and cats, this sort of, if you look at the actual top content reports, it's not even political content really. It's just these sort of weird human interest stories and clickbait. And again, I don't think that there's anything remotely, there's nothing arguably harmful about that. It is sort of cheap entertainment. People are going to watch what they want to watch. The question for the platforms then becomes, what do you do when you have these other categories? Where is the platform pushing someone with a new cancer diagnosis to the smoothie group an ethical thing to do? The smoothie group can be there. If you want to go find your smoothies, great, but does it need to, when it intuits that you have a new cancer diagnosis based on your browsing behavior or what your search is changing, is it ethical for it to kind of push you that stuff? And I've argued that the answer is no, and that is where that delineation between free speech, meaning the ability to be and speak on the platform, versus free reach, which is where the platform is proactively pushing it out and essentially doing the recruiting for you.
I was going to bring that up because that is a phrase that you are very famous for, is the speech not reach one. When did you write that? Was that a piece in the Atlantic? Where it was like
No, that was
2018 or
early.
something?
It was 2018. So that was Wired. Full credit to the phrase goes to Asa Raskin, because we were so I was advising Center for Humane Tech. This was like the early days, right, of some of these kind of, how do you give the public a framework to think about this split? And we were going back and forth, and I was trying to write an essay on it. And we were just kind of whiteboarding, and it kind of came up in a whiteboarding session, and I was like, there we go. Okay, now we have something like that says it a lot better than my several hundred words on it. So let's do this. Let's use this article as a way to take that concept, that distillation of what we've been trying to say, and kind of put it out there to the public. And so it was very interesting to see how it got picked up and where it went. Because Asa and I wrote that essay in 2018. He was at Burning Man. I remember because we had all of a sudden this news hook had come up. I don't remember what it was. It had something to do with like Trump yelling at Google for suppressing, allegedly suppressing something. And I was like, okay, here we go. This is let's write this. And I just kind of got it out the door. And it over the years, I think Sacha Baron Cohen used it in a speech related to anti-Semitism online. It sits on top of Elon Musk's. It is his content moderation policy. It is enshrined in the algorithm. You can go and you can look at the code on GitHub, and it's in there. And
You
I
were
was
like,
like,
not the impact I was expecting to have when I wrote it
I
when I
mean,
wrote a
no,
piece.
I have a lot of differences of opinion with Elon on many, 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 many things, and very strong feelings about that company at this point. But it is, in my opinion, like it is the only policy that works if you have a platform that is going to rank something, right? You can argue for middleware, which I have been, by the way. You can argue that users should have more control over their experiences directly. You can argue that there are that individuals should be given the power to determine their rankings and their kind of moderation tolerances. That's really not technologically feasible on a centralized platform. And for business reasons, they're also not particularly interested in investing time and resources in that kind of granularity of control on all things. So you're starting to see it come up in platforms like Blue Sky, right, where it is sort of central to the development of the product, this idea that users can sort of subscribe to moderation tools or subscribe to various labeling rubrics or share block lists and things like this. And I think that's fantastic. But on a centralized platform, this is unfortunately, in my opinion, that this is the way that it has to be done. And so I am, whatever I think of Twitter, I'm at least pleased that other people, even ideologically, maybe my polar opposites, got there as well.
So one of the things that you talk a lot about is well, your job is to do research. There we go. I found my train of thought. I had lost it there for a second. But your job is to research this stuff. That
Yeah.
is what you're doing, and that is what you're working on. One of the challenges with the algorithms now is how much of it is also on connected content. So the
Yeah.
platforms are actually taking on more control, if you will, or you're playing a bigger even role of what people are seeing in their feeds because people are posting less. So it's less about who you're following. It's less about searching for hashtags and stuff like that. And you have a really great line about how researching TikTok is like searching the dictionary for a word you don't know how to spell. And so, how has doing research on these platforms changed and evolved? And what are the challenges now in such a fragmented environment and this unconnected content environment of even really being able to understand the information ecosystem that people are operating in?
Yeah. So when we were doing, we just did some whole bunch of work on AI generated content in spam and scams, right? So just how are pages on Facebook using image generation tools to capture attention and then to direct people in sometimes unfortunate ways. And so one of the things that was interesting to me about that was, again, once I had engaged with the content, we started doing this around Christmas time, around December of last year. And as I was kind of visiting these pages, making these lists, and we do what we call snowballing, right? You look to the page to see what it is sharing, what it is recommending, what the algorithm recommends adjacent to it. Does the owner of the page appear to own other pages? Does the owner of the page moderate a group? If so, who are the co-moderators of the group? Do they have pages, right? So you do these big sort of crawls, just sort of snowballing from one to the next. And so I was engaging with a lot of this content. And then all of a sudden, again, and this is what used to happen with the vaccine situation too, actually, the vaccine groups, the algorithm starts pushing stuff to me, right? So now all of a sudden, I don't even have to go looking because it's just, it's just coming to me. And so this is one of the ways that you then and it indicates like suggested for you. Sometimes you see that because I'm like, where is this page? What is this page? I got one this morning. It was like something related to gardening, ostensibly, where you could quote unquote buy seeds, and it was all like AI generated plants. Like these flowers don't exist in the world, but here, visit our website, you can buy the seeds. That kind of scam. So these were the sorts of things where it was very much a push. And so I started looking with my co-author on the project. I looked at the content reports, right? Again, they put out these transparency reports, and they do have a thing, and it indicates that over the last couple of years, it's gone from about like 8% in feed of this unfollowed content to a little over 20% or so. So you see a very significant increase. And that's Facebook kind of chasing TikTok because TikTok has this, who you follow is not necessarily relevant to what you see in a lot of ways. It's a combination of what we call collaborative filtering, where you're seeing content that is similar to content that people like you engage with. There's sometimes a geographical component to it, but also it's just the algorithm has decided that this is the thing that will make you happy. And in this interest of, giving you serendipity, it just kind of pushes it to you. And so you wind up down these sort of weird rabbit holes. What's challenging with TikTok is that you can't quite tell why certain videos perform the way that they do. So we were looking at a network on TikTok. We did this project with the BBC where it was Russia linked accounts, and TikTok did eventually confirm that, producing content about Ukraine. And they were making these allegations that these Ukrainian government officials, even down to the mayoral level, were corrupt. They have yachts, they have dachas, etc. And the network produced about 100,000 accounts, right? And the accounts largely all said the same thing. But sometimes one of the videos would have 1 million views, whereas all the other ones had like 1,000 views. And it was completely opaque as to why this had happened because they didn't have anything in the realm of a follower count that would indicate that they should have had that kind of engagement. There wasn't indications that, you know, like sometimes you see it where kind of manipulative accounts will retweet something until it gets enough juice to then actually be retweeted. So there's this dynamic that's happening where you actually can't figure out why something is going viral on TikTok. And even the APIs that they offer researchers will provide you with visibility into engagements and stats, but no visibility into what got recommended and what got boosted. So when you're trying to do something like understand political content in an election year, searching for keywords is not going to get you is what you want, right? It's not going to get you necessarily the most viral content on that because that's just not how the data is returned. So you have this moment where platforms are actually moving back to this very heavily recommended, heavily kind of push style model of content distribution, even as researchers have almost no visibility into what gets pushed or why.
So your work has not come without controversy, particularly amongst a faction of the Republican Party, and I definitely say faction because it is not all of us who believe this, and I refuse to be lumped in with them. But it has gotten politicized, and you talk
Yeah.
about the trending topics controversy that happened at Facebook, and I always mention that to people as like one of the key turning points in this conversation that we are having today around what is actually censorship, what are researchers doing, what is the government doing, what are the platforms doing. It's all gotten conflated by all sorts of people. The Twitter files did not help as part of this. You're our leader of the censorship industrial complex.
That's right. You're part of
According
it too, right? We all work for the CIA. There's
We
puppet
do.
masters everywhere. Yeah.
It's such a secret CIA operative that neither of us knew that we were CIA operatives as part of all this. So, for those that aren't familiar, do you mind giving a little bit? I think most listeners are, but do you mind giving a little bit of an overview of sort of how this work has gotten politicized and the challenges that has posed?
Yeah. So first of all, one of the things that I think it's important to note foundationally is that platforms offer they're tools of power, right? You have to just sort of, even as we joke around about, shrimp Jesus, the AI figures or this other stuff, for political leaders globally, they offer an opportunity to shape public opinion in very, very direct and influential ways. Same thing with marketers, right? Again, just kind of calling back to our conversation earlier about the kind of propaganda and marketing being interrelated. So that is the groundwork. And so what you see is what I call ref working. I think other people call it ref working, where members of one kind of political faction or another will argue that someone has put their thumb on the scale, right? And the algorithm is unfair to me and my group, right? And you see it constantly. You see, in the days after October 7th, Facebook is censoring pro-Israel content. Facebook is censoring pro-Palestine content. This is a global kind of, set of opinions that people hold. You see it outside the US, but it's very much interesting because the companies are headquartered here. The US culture wars have a profound impact and influence in the ref working conversation. And so what you see is with Trending Topics Gate, there were a bunch of these really spammy domains that were actually turned out later to be run by Macedonian teenagers that were putting out fake news. And by that, I mean headlines that said things like Megyn Kelly fired from Fox News or Pope endorses Donald Trump, things that were fake news. But they were going viral, right? Because they managed to hit that kind of clickbait, you know, thing, and they were getting shared by a lot of people. And so Facebook's editorial team on the trending topics board would try to remove these things as they were coming through low quality domains. But now when you say the phrase low quality domain, whoa, what does she mean? She must mean right wing populists, right? She must mean left wing populists. Because the idea that something is low quality, they see as an inherently political statement, right? That you must be biased against the political alignment of the content. And so that's where you start to see that ref working taking place as platforms are always going to be ranking and curating content. This gets reframed as being the quote arbiters of truth, because what you do start to see is platforms beginning to try to fact check and label this content. Again, if the content is there, if it's going viral, okay, rather than taking it down, if there's no demonstrable harm, we'll put a label on it. This comes to be one of the major ways that they begin to intervene. And I think that labeling is great. I think that that's always preferable to, or in most cases, that is preferable to a takedown. But you start to see that then get reframed as censorship, right? So now every type of act of content moderation is being reframed as an act of censorship. If things are not recommended, that's censorship. If they're downranked, that's censorship. Labeled, that's censorship. Takedown, that's censorship. And so by using this word, they essentially, which they have stripped of all meaning at this point, they basically make it such that no action that in any way impedes any kind of virality of even the most absolutely like bullshit fake news story, all of a sudden has been reframed as a platform suppressing some form of political speech. And so in the work we did in election 2020, we looked at viral narratives that were narrowly scoped around procedures and policies of voting. So somebody saying that you should go vote on Wednesday, not on Tuesday, or someone giving a bad date for the end of mail-in voting in the region, that kind of stuff. And then election delegitimization, right? We cared a lot about these baseless allegations that began to go viral about there are mail-in ballots in a ditch, ergo, this election is going to be stolen. There was one that was like, look, all of these mail-in ballots in a dumpster, here they are. They're throwing away your ballots, and it turns out that they're disposing of ballots from 2018, but the story has gone viral already. So we start engaging around trying to understand what that content looks like, what's going viral. And we do engage with state and local election officials who are periodically flagging things for us. They're saying, hey, look at this. Oftentimes it's a random account with 2 likes, but somebody is wrong on the internet. So we would go and we would kind of look at it. And then in situations where there was something that appeared to be going viral, we would occasionally, after we did our own internal analysis, give it to a platform and say, hey, take a look, moderate it under your own policies, but here's a viral story related to the election that you should be aware of. And that was the work. It got reframed as like, the deep state put us up to it. The Biden regime funded it with a, NSF grant to reward us for installing him into power. I mean, these people are now arguing that we were the way that the election was stolen from Trump, because of course all of the court cases in which he's alleged it was stolen have not panned out, right? Because it wasn't. And so we've now moved into this wild conspiracy theory in which academics studying social media narratives were actually running a vast censorship and suppression campaign, because even looking at these narratives, even like reporting on these narratives, counting the number of tweets in a narrative, with just the mere act of counting it got reframed as like these were the tweets they suppressed. And it's actually really it's stupid in a lot of ways, like it kind of beggars belief. But the problem is that people with subpoena power picked it up and ran with it because it was politically advantageous to them. Again, going back to what I said in the beginning of this very long answer, which is that, these are tools of power. And if you can work the refs and silence the people who are trying to, to expose how some of these narratives operate, why they go viral and how, and, people who make arguments, as we did in our 200-page final report, arguing about, how platforms should consider these things, you can tilt the playing field in your favor.
What have you learned from this entire experience? Some people have, many organizations, especially when you get the lawyers involved, they're like, just be quiet, don't engage, don't push back. But folks like you and Nina and Kate and many others, noticing that many of them are female, that are also being attacked on this, are pushing back now, are being like, no, there are facts here about what we are doing. You do not get to just, and you bring this all up too in the vaccine argument a lot throughout the book, of like this vocal minority who seems to get to shape the overall opinion, whereas the silent majority, it's really hard to get them to like actively engage in it and stuff like that. So I want to know what you've learned from this, because I think you brought up in a conversation we had recently about a concern, and I'm concerned about this too, that trust and safety and this work that is being done by tech workers is going to suffer the same fate as we go through this 2024 election. And so being able to learn from what you all have gone through and seen this play out, I think can be really helpful for that community as well.
So I think it's important, again, so much of how public opinion is shaped is through framing, right? It's through saying, like, by trying to make content moderation synonymous with censorship, you delegitimize the enterprise because censorship is bad, right? We now see, there's this kind of academic research. We don't really do very much with it, but we don't do anything with it at SIO. We just kind of follow it. Pre-bunking, right? The idea that you can tell people in advance, hey, you're likely to see this kind of information. Here's how those narratives work. You're likely to see this kind of rhetoric. Here's how that sort of propaganda operates. Pre-bunking is now brainwashing, right? Health information programs that the NIH was running that they appear to have either stalled or killed, telling people your mammogram won't give you cancer. Well, health misinformation is now, reframed as the tyrannical government, lying to you about vaccines in the days after COVID. So what you're seeing is like that sort of framing is happening because people are out there constantly articulating these points to their readers, or entire Substacks that do nothing other than gin up fear and write wild conspiracy theories and just this innuendo laden bullshit. But they're out there and they're gaining audience members, and it's very entertaining, and so it's attracting a following. And then you have institutions, and for most of the last 40 years or so, particularly in the broadcast media environment, the response to somebody criticizing you or lying about you or smearing you was to say nothing. Well, don't feed the trolls, or well, maybe we'll respond in a quote in the media, but probably we just won't dignify it. As the media ecosystem has fragmented, what you see is institutions that they just don't engage. So the narratives about them are being shaped. The sort of rumors and lies are going viral, and the institution is essentially silent. And so for me, this was a source of quite a lot of frustration, and I do talk about it in the book, the idea that that saying nothing is somehow the right answer. It's not, because then the rumors ossify on the internet. When people search for it, that's what they see. You see, then once the articles are written, someone will go and will cite them in Wikipedia, and then like Google AI will return the bullshit in the AI generated search results now, right? So you have this entire process that's happening as people are shaping reality on the internet, and the institutions are just over there saying nothing. Or assuming that if they give one quote to the Washington Post, if they even do that, then that's the end of it, right? And there's a reliance on this kind of legacy trust, this belief that, well, people will always trust us because of our storied brand, and they don't understand, they haven't internalized yet that this is how opinion is shaped today, and you have to be out there putting out the counter narratives. When I got smeared by this newsletter troll named Michael Schellenberger, what he did was very interesting, because I had engaged with him as a source for several months, trying to help him understand things he was seeing in the Twitter files. And I had a very candid back and forth over WhatsApp and other things for a long time, kind of explaining what he thought he was seeing versus what I thought he was seeing as somebody much more familiar with trust and safety and content moderation. And he still smeared me anyway in the end. He still wrote this whole long bullshit screed about how I ran the censorship industrial complex. And so I responded to that not by engaging in some back and forth with him, but publishing all of my text messages with him. Because I think people deserve to see, here's the actual conversation we had. Here are my actual opinions. Here are the things that I, Renee, believe. And then you can go back and you can look at how that man over there characterized it all. But you can come back and you can see my point of view and what I actually said. And when I did this, it did go viral because people were realizing that these two things were not the same. Right. And it was an opportunity to really get that out there very directly. Not everybody necessarily has the appetite for it, but I think that people who are told to stay quiet and say nothing at this point need to really consider that advice and whether it serves them if they don't correct the record, because the lies just ossify.
Well, Renee, we'll end it there. Invisible Rulers, everybody should go and buy it. Check out Renee if she is doing a book tour near you. I'll link to everything in the show notes. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.